This morning, almost immediately upon finding the photographs, I called the number on the card that Detective Patterson left with me. I intended to tell her about what had happened with the envelope on my doorstep, but I was thrown off by the voice that answered the phone, which was distinctly not Miss Patterson's. It was a receptionist of sorts for the homicide department, and when I gave her my name and told her what the information was in relation to, she became much less friendly over the phone. She started speaking quietly. She seemed to grow colder and colder the more we spoke. I asked her if I could speak with Detective Patterson. She said, "No, but Detective Patterson will call you back." I asked if there were any advances in the case. She said, "Detective Patterson will call you back." I asked if Detective Patterson was even there. The receptionist simply said again, "Detective Patterson will call you back." Finally growing admittedly angry, I started shouting, and to be honest, I don't really remember what I said. I was paranoid, I was angry, and I wanted an explanation, but all I got was her shouting, "Sir, sir, sir," multiple times before stating once more, "Detective Patterson will call you back." Hearing the digital tone indicating that the person on the other end had hung up, I sat there in shock for a moment. I didn't know what the fuck had just happened. I thought I'd call up the cops and tell them the problem and they'd, I don't know, send some armed guards to protect me or something. I at least expected to be able to speak with someone other than Miss Detective Patterson will call you back. I was pissed. I went to trusty Google to find answers. I looked up Detective Patterson first, but I couldn't find anything about her. I did, however, find a man named Clive Patterson, rather, Captain Clive Patterson. After looking at websites and articles, I discovered that he was the current captain in charge of the homicide department here. I also found that he had 2 children, a daughter, Heather, who was 30 years old, and a son, Peter, who was 22. His wife, Heather, and Peter's mother, Angelina Patterson, had gone missing about a year ago. There were numerous articles written about the immense strength that the Patterson family was showing through the adversity, and most journalists made sure to show Clive as a hero of sorts. Only when I ventured into the obscure real crime forums did I find theories that Clive had killed her, as he had been the last person to see her before, according to Clive. She left for a walk at the Cherry Creek Reservoir. As soon as I finished reading about this, my phone started ringing, and lo and behold, it was Detective Patterson finally getting back to me. I asked that we meet in person, somewhere public. She agreed, and around 3 o'clock we met at Subway on Colfax. I brought the manila envelope containing the aluminum lockbox, and she brought her partner, a man who introduced himself as Rory Jones. In the previous post, I never really explained what Miss Patterson looked like. For 30 years old, she looked incredibly young. If I didn't know better, I would have assumed she was fresh out of the academy. Her dark hair was kept in a tight bun, but the all-business hairstyle didn't distract from her pretty face. She looks like what you'd expect Hollywood to cast as a woman detective. Rory Jones, however, was anything but the picturesque hero detective. He was short, pudgy, and had a hairline that seemed to be running away from his face, which looked like a sort of chubby David Cross. I showed them the pictures and explained when and how I found them. Detective Jones seemed intrigued, frightened even. Detective Patterson? She seemed to dismiss everything I had to say. Like I said earlier, I read a lot of true crime stuff, and in a lot of cases where they convict the wrong person, they sort of get a tunnel vision and only see evidence that fits their explanation of the events. I assumed this is what was happening. Detective Patterson was eager to leave, while Jones wasn't. When Patterson started to stand up, indicating she was ready to depart, however, Jones seemed hesitant to protest. So much so that he said nothing. He just looked at me, then at Patterson, then hung his head ever so slightly in shame. They started to leave, without even taking the photos with them, and I just sat there, immobilized by the shock that they were doing nothing to help me. They were already out the door before I could even finish putting the pictures away. Stuffing them into the lockbox, I glanced up, looking out the large storefront windows to see Patterson sitting in the driver's seat while Jones stood holding the passenger door open, looking my direction. I looked back down to slide the box into the envelope and started to exit the restaurant. As I stepped out the door and glanced in their direction, Jones had begun walking towards me and begun subtly gesturing for me to turn around while mouthing the phrase, "Go inside," while not making a sound. I obliged. I re-entered Subway and he followed, glancing over his shoulder as he let the door close behind him. He said in a quiet, rushed tone, "We don't have long. She thinks I'm pissing." He proceeded to gesture for me to follow as he entered the restroom. I did so. He continued, "You know Detective Lyle? James Lyle? He was my partner for, I don't know, 10, 12 years? I didn't really know how to respond to this information, so I simply gave this sort of pathetic shrug. He leaned as though he'd be able to see through the crack of the door before looking back to me and saying, "You live at this place, right? I want to find out what the fuck is going on. I'll swing by after my shift. I get off late. Don't fall asleep." Before I could even respond, he darted out the bathroom door. He was too paranoid that Detective Patterson seeing us together would be a problem. I waited about 30 seconds before I exited. Their squad car was gone, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I drove home and started writing this down. I thought that a meeting with the cops would put my worries at ease, but now I'm more anxious than ever. I suppose all I can do now is wait for Rory and hope that this steak knife I'm desperately holding on to will be enough to protect myself if need arises. I will follow up on my meeting with Detective Jones as soon as I can. After ordering in and having my Chinese food feast delivered to my door, I was surprised by my ability to have an appetite despite the terrifying box of photos resting on my coffee table. I stress ate until I couldn't eat anymore. When you're stuffing delicious chow mein into your gullet, you can almost forget that you're scared to even step out of your own home. For those of you in the area, you know it's been cooling down around Denver and Aurora, and it's raining as I write this. Last night was especially chilly, as I'd left the windows open so I could hear any and all of the footsteps on the sidewalk outside. I was just wearing this ghetto t-shirt with the Colorado flag on it that I got for free from setting up a bank account, and sweat so I was shivering. I had this horrible tacky bathrobe with the Batman emblems all over it, so to warm up I grabbed that and threw it on. You know how when you eat your heart out and you finally sit back in a comfortable chair, then 2 hours later you wake up? Yeah, I drift off into something of a food coma and was rudely awakened by the sound of angry barking. Fido, one of my neighbor's dogs, barks at just about everything that happens. Still being jolted awake by the ever so pleasant noise of an aggravated dog was a frightening experience. I jumped to my feet, paranoid that Fido was barking at the Polaroid butcher as he prepared to sneak into my apartment. As stealthily as I could, I went to each of my windows, looking in every possible direction, trying to see something. Then, I heard footsteps. They were quiet, scraping footsteps, almost like metal cleats scratching along cement. Then, they grew louder, closer. Then they stopped. Then there was a knock at my door. Then another. Then another. 3 slow, spaced out knocks. I approached the door, making as little sound as possible while doing so, to look out of the eye hole. If it weren't for the theories that you folks had proposed, seeing that it was Rory Jones would have put me at ease. In his hands he was carrying a large bulky suitcase and was wearing street clothes. Before opening the door, I grabbed a steak knife and took a deep breath trying to portray some sort of calmness. Rory slowly grew visible as the door opened, and his pudgy face, adorned with the expression of slight shame, instantly calmed my nerves. He stated, in a fashion similar to that of a child fearing its mother's response, "My shoes are fucking filthy." And they were. They looked as though they had been walked through mud with, then simply allowed to dry, caked into the shoes. He continued, "Is it weird if I waltz around in my socks?" With a laugh, I shook my head. Something about Rory comforts me. He has this air about him, like he's the uncle your parents dislike, but you and your siblings love. It's hard to explain, and it's even harder to justify a general vibe having so much power over how I feel about a person. As he entered with a smile, he exclaimed, "That's a great fucking bathrobe." I'd almost forgotten that I was wearing my bummy Colorado t-shirt and that god-awful Batman robe. But something about Rory kept me from being too embarrassed about it. After letting him into the house, I offered the usual stuff you offer someone that's just entered your home. Water, snacks, that kind of thing. He graciously turned down the offer, plopped down by the coffee table, and began to unload his suitcase. He spoke while doing so. "So, I was Detective Lyle's partner. This whole fucking thing happens, and then goddamn Captain Patterson wedges his golden child in the middle of all this shit." By now, he had removed 2 notebooks, a little bag of pens, and a manila envelope with what I could assume was a lockbox inside. He continued, "Nothing against her. She's an alright person. But goddamn, her numbers are so padded. She just looks for citations to give, shit like that. But," he trailed off, looking away from his things and up to me. "That's beside the point. I'm here about," he set a basic folder labeled Hector Brown on the table and looked up to me with the serious face that could muster. "This guy. I don't think he's the..." He cut me off before I could finish. "Neither do I." I was confused. He must have been able to tell. He explained, "Hector Brown is not mentally fit to exist by himself, let alone carry out something this complicated. He can barely fucking talk. Oh, and he can't read." To say the least, I was surprised at this machine gun spewing of information. I half expected a similarly cold, no progress sort of encounter, but Rory basically hesitated to start divulging classified information to me. He barely gave me time to think before I explained further. "I don't think poor old Hector did this. He's living off welfare and disability. He's... shit, I don't know. What's politically correct? He's insane. I think he's taken advantage of. I think he was used." "Do you think it was someone he knew?" "That's the thing. We looked into it. His mother used to stay with him, but she had diabetes, I think. She had complications or something. She died a few years back. Since then, he hasn't had a, caretaker or anything like that." "Do you have any evidence against him?" I paused, just briefly enough for Rory to open his mouth, but I specified before he made a sound. "Any real evidence?" He opened his mouth again, as though to start speaking, but closed his lips as to rethink what he was about to say. He did this before making a sound that I can only describe as sort of a baffled sigh. He ran his hands through his hair before beginning his spiel. "So, before I can get into any of that, we gotta rewind a bit, okay?" He looked at me for a response, which I gave in the form of a nod, before he carried on. "Rosa Vallejos, other than the obvious gut wounds, she had absolutely no marks on her body at all. The coroner report says they believe she was alive for the removal of her organs, or at least the incision along her sternum. She didn't have any bruises, any cuts, any scratches, scrapes, nothing. Not even from the boat, the one he must have taken her out there in. There weren't even fingerprints on her. There wasn't anything in her either." "What about the lockbox on the pictures?" "Nope, nothing. Though our little techie geek, his name is Marcus, I think. I don't know. Anyways, he said every single one of these Polaroids was taken with a... He was unable to recall the name. Started snapping in the air before shuffling through his suitcase, removing a small scrap of paper from it. Squinting at the paper, he read it out loud. One stop 600 Polaroid camera. No wait. One step 600 Polaroid camera. He set the scrap of paper in front of me, as if I wanted to read it for myself. He pulled out a couple of more papers, which looked like photocopies of some sort of paperwork. He spread the papers out, making all of their contents visible. It appeared to be a list of evidence collected from Hector's apartment. Rory inquired, "Do you see a one-step 600 Polaroid camera in there?" I didn't. "Do you see any one-step 600 Polaroid film in there?" I did, a lot. "So you think you're saying..." I found myself stumbling over my words. "You think the guy's still out there?" Rory nodded, slowly. Hoping that he miraculously did, I inquired, "Do you have any idea who it might be?" He shrugged, before failing to hide a tiny smirk as he spoke. "Captain Peterson considered making you a suspect, dumbass." He continuously shook his head as he dug through his suitcase, as though he was still disagreeing with the captain. He removed a stack of pictures printed out on normal printer paper, held together with a paper clip. He spread them out. "What are these?" I could tell there were countless out-of-focus pictures of the fiasco surrounding the playground on which Detective Lyle's son was left, flayed for the world to see. But the photos were so obviously taken by someone desperate to just capture a glimpse of the crime scene. Rory started pointing to a specific man that kept popping up in each of these photos. A middle-aged man wearing khaki pants and a wrinkled dress shirt, holding a one-step 600 Polaroid camera. As I looked at more and more of the out-of-focus photographs, I began to recognize that the man taking the pictures with the Polaroid camera was undoubtedly Hector Brown. I recoiled, tilting my head and leaning back, perplexed by what was in front of me.